It's just past midnight over the Iranian coastline, and somewhere above the Strait of Hormuz, a pilot flips a switch that ends decades of a program most Americans have never heard of. Seconds later, a bomb the size of a small bus falls out of the sky at nearly the speed of sound, punches through more than 60 FT of reinforced rock and concrete, and detonates deep underground. On the surface, there's barely a flash. No mushroom cloud, no fireball you'd see in a movie, just a tremor, a puff of dust, and then silence. But underneath that patch of desert it took Iran years and billions of dollars to build simply stops existing. Gone in a fraction of a second, with almost nothing visible above ground to show for it. This is the story of America's bunker buster bombs, the weapons that were built for exactly one purpose, and how they went from a classified engineering problem to the centerpiece of one of the most closely watched military campaigns in the world. And to really understand what these weapons do and why they matter so much right now, we're going to follow this story through the eyes of three different people. Me, walking you through what's verified and what's still uncertain. A former Air Force weapons officer, someone we'll call Dave, whose identity we're protecting but whose knowledge of these exact systems is real, to help translate the engineering into plain English. And a Gulf shipping captain we'll call Marcus, whose composite experience reflects what sailors moving through the Strait of Hormuz have actually described in the press, to help you understand why this all matters far beyond the battlefield. Let's get into it. To understand the weapon, you first have to understand the problem it was built to solve. For most of modern history, if you wanted to destroy a building, you dropped on top of it. That works fine for a factory or a bridge. It does not work if your enemy simply moves everything important underground. And starting in the 1990s, that is exactly what a handful of countries began doing, burying their most sensitive military and nuclear infrastructure under mountains, inside hardened bunkers beneath layers of reinforced concrete designed specifically to shrug off conventional bombs. Iran's nuclear program is one of the most well-known examples of this strategy. Facilities like Fordo were deliberately built into the side of a mountain, with reports over the years estimating anywhere from 20 to nearly 90 millimeters of rock covering the enrichment halls below. That is not a target you can hit with a regular bomb and expect results. You need something that can survive slamming into solid rock at hundreds of miles an hour without breaking apart, and then still have enough integrity left to punch even deeper before it explodes. The idea of a bomb built specifically to punch through hardened ground isn't new. It actually traces back to the Gulf War in 1991, when American commanders realized they had no reliable way to destroy Iraqi command bunkers buried deep underground. Engineers at the time reportedly improvised a solution in a matter of weeks, taking surplus artillery gun barrels, packing them with explosives, and fitting them with guidance kits to create what became the GBU-28. It was a rushed, almost improvised weapon born out of an urgent battlefield need. And it worked well enough that it stayed in the American arsenal for decades afterward. Over time, as potential adversaries kept digging deeper and building thicker, the military kept refining the concept, eventually producing dedicated purpose-built successors rather than repurposed artillery tubes. That lineage matters because it tells you these weapons weren't dreamed up as some kind of shock and awe showpiece. They were built, generation after generation, as a direct answer to a very specific and very practical problem, an enemy that had learned to hide its most important assets underground. That is where the bunker buster comes in today. And this is where I want to bring in Dave, because he's the one who can explain how these things actually work without turning this into a physics lecture. Dave spent years working around precision munitions before moving into private consulting. And here's how he put it to me. He said, think of a bunker buster, less like a normal bomb and more like a very expensive, very precise nail. The nail doesn't need to be full of explosives to do damage. It needs to be heavy, needs to be shaped right, and needs to hit at exactly the right angle and speed to drive itself deep into the target before anything goes off. Most of the weight in a weapon like the GBU-57, which the military nicknames the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, isn't even explosive filler. It's hardened steel casing built specifically to survive the impact. Only after the casing has done its job plowing through rock and concrete does the actual warhead detonate, and by then, it's already buried tens of meters below the surface. The GBU-57 is the biggest of these weapons in the American arsenal, and it is genuinely massive. It weighs around 30,000 lb, roughly the weight of a loaded school bus, and it's about 20 ft long. Only one aircraft in the world is currently configured to carry it in combat, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, because you need both the size and the ability to slip past air defenses undetected to deliver something like this. It was specifically designed with deeply buried hardened nuclear facilities in mind. And for years, its most famous real-world use was against Iran's Fordo enrichment site. But the Massive Ordnance Penetrator isn't the only tool in this family, and honestly, it's not even the one doing most of the work in the current campaign. Below it in size, you've got weapons like the GBU-72, sometimes called the Advanced 5K Penetrator, which weighs around 5,000 LLB. It was actually designed as a replacement for an older Gulf War-era bunker buster called the GBU-28. And unlike the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, it can be carried by more conventional aircraft, including the F-15E Strike Eagle, along with bombers like the B-1. That matters strategically, because it means the military doesn't have to send in a lone stealth bomber every single time they want to hit something buried. They can use existing fighter jets already flying missions in the region. Then, there's an even more common weapon, the GBU-31, which pairs a JDAM guidance kit with a 2,000 LB penetrating warhead. This one has reportedly been used extensively throughout the campaign against Iran, hitting ammunition depots, command facilities, and hardened storage sites that don't require the same overwhelming penetration as something like Fordo, but still need more punch than a standard bomb. So here's the actual hierarchy of these weapons, and I think this is the part that gets lost in a lot of the coverage out there. These are not interchangeable weapons where bigger is always better. And country military planners are choosing specific bombs, specifically based on how deep something is buried, how hardened the structure is, and what kind of aircraft is available to deliver it. A missile storage site under a hillside might only need a 2,000 LB penetrator. An underground command bunker might call for the 5,000 LB version. And something like a deeply buried nuclear enrichment hall protected by dozens of meters of rock might be the only scenario where you actually need to bring out the 30,000 LB Massive Ordnance Penetrator. And even then, reports have indicated that multiple of these weapons may be required in sequence to fully destroy a target that deep. Fordo itself has a long and complicated history. Iran's government did not initially disclose the facility to international inspectors, and its existence became public only after intelligence services from multiple countries identified it in the late 2000s, at which point Iran acknowledged the site but maintained it was intended for peaceful purposes. Built into a mountainside near the city of Qom, Fordo became a symbol in Western defense circles of exactly the kind of target that conventional bombs simply could not reach. And for years, discussions about how to deal with Iran's nuclear program kept circling back to the same uncomfortable question, namely, whether any weapon in the American or Israeli arsenal could actually reach it. The eventual answer to that question was the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, and its use against Fordo became one of the most closely watched military actions in recent memory, precisely because it settled, in a very literal sense, a debate that had gone on for over a decade among analysts, policymakers, and military planners alike. The Strait of Hormuz carries its own history, entirely separate from the nuclear question, and it's worth understanding on its own terms, because it explains why a strike on a missile site near the coastline can matter just as much as a strike on a nuclear facility. The strait is a narrow channel, at its tightest point only about 21 nautical miles wide, separating Iran from Oman and the United Arab Emirates. It has been a flashpoint for decades. During the so-called war in the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, both sides attacked commercial shipping moving through the same waters, eventually drawing the United States Navy into direct escort operations to keep tankers moving. Every few years since then, tensions in the region have flared up around the same basic question: whether Iran can or will attempt to choke off a waterway that carries roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply on any given day. This current conflict is, in that sense, not an entirely new story. It is the latest and by far the most intense chapter in a rivalry over control of that waterway that stretches back nearly half a century. Now, let's talk about what has actually been confirmed happening on the ground, because this is where I want to be very careful to separate what's been officially verified from what is still speculation, because a lot of channels covering this conflict blur that line, and I don't want to do that to you. In mid-March of 2026, U.S. Central Command confirmed that American forces struck Iranian coastal missile facilities along the Strait of Hormuz using multiple 5,000 LB deep penetrator bombs. These were reportedly GBU-72 weapons, and the stated target was hardened sites housing Iranian anti-ship cruise missiles, weapons capable of threatening the tankers and cargo ships that move through that narrow waterway every single day. Central Command's own statement framed this specifically as protecting a corridor that handles close to 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply. That is not a small detail. It is in many ways the entire reason this particular front of the conflict matters as much as it does. Later that same month, reporting also emerged through outlets tracking the war closely describing U.S. strikes, using $2,000 LB bunker buster bombs against a large ammunition depot near the city of Isfahan, a location long known as a hub for Iranian military and nuclear-related infrastructure. Footage of the strike, which circulated publicly, showed a large primary explosion followed by a series of secondary blasts, which analysts generally interpret as a signature of stored munitions or propellant igniting after the initial impact, rather than the bomb itself producing that much force on its own. There have also been reports, though this next part is less concretely confirmed and deserves that caveat, of a strike on an underground headquarters linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps near Tehran, reportedly carried out by B-2 bombers using the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, the same weapon used against Fordo previously. This reporting has come primarily through outlets citing defense officials speaking on background, which is common in wartime reporting, but does mean we should hold it a little more loosely than something confirmed directly and on the record by Central Command. This is a good moment to bring in Marcus, because all of this technical and tactical detail can start to feel abstract if you don't understand what it actually means for the people whose lives intersect with the Strait of Hormuz every single day. Marcus is a composite figure representing the kind of experience that multiple tanker captains and shipping industry sources have described publicly since this conflict began. Picture a man in his 50s who has spent almost 30 years moving crude oil and cargo through some of the most contested waters on the planet. He's seen plenty of tense moments in that region over the decades, close calls with smaller patrol boats, warnings broadcast over the radio, the occasional escort from a naval vessel, keeping watch a few miles off his stern. But what he and sailors like him have described this year is different, not just in intensity, but in kind. Before this conflict, transit through the strait was mostly routine. A few hours of heightened attention as the ship narrowed through the channel, constant radio chatter, radar screens crowded with other vessels making the same crossing. And country reports indicate that on a typical pre-war day, well over 100 ships might pass through that stretch of water. Now, picture that same captain checking in with his shipping company before agreeing to take a route anywhere near that corridor. Listening to briefings about which sections of the coastline have reportedly had missile sites destroyed and which ones haven't been confirmed as cleared yet, and making a judgment call that used to be about weather and traffic and is now about whether his ship might become a target. Reports describe roughly 20 commercial vessels having been attacked in and around the strait since the war began, some hit by missiles, others by drones, and at least one incident involving a fire severe enough that the crew had to abandon ship entirely. For someone like Marcus, that's not a headline scrolling past on a phone. That's a conversation with his own crew about hazard pay, about whether the insurance on this particular voyage even covers what they're about to sail into, about calling home before losing signal in a stretch of water where help might be a long way off if something goes wrong. And that risk is exactly why the bunker buster strikes near the Strait of Hormuz so much beyond the immediate military objective. Iran's anti-ship missile sites weren't randomly placed. Reports describe them as deliberately hardened positions along the coastline, built specifically to survive conventional airstrikes, so that Iran could maintain the ability to threaten shipping even under sustained pressure. Destroying them with penetrating munitions wasn't just about eliminating a military asset. It was about trying to restore the flow of one of the most important trade routes on the planet, one that touches the price of gasoline, heating oil, and countless goods far beyond the region itself. In the weeks following the escalation, oil prices reportedly jumped more than 40%, pushing above $100 a barrel. And domestic gas prices in the United States reportedly crossed $4 a gallon for the first time in several years. That is the kind of ripple effect that turns a regional military campaign into something that shows up in your own grocery budget. It's also worth understanding how this campaign has rippled out beyond just the United States and Iran, because a conflict over a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz almost never stays contained to countries. Gulf allies, including the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, have reportedly become more directly involved as the conflict progressed, both in defending against Iranian-aligned proxy activity and, in some reporting, in contributing their own strikes. European governments have found themselves in an uncomfortable position, with reports describing American bombers operating out of bases on British territory, prompting public statements from British officials attempting to draw a distinction between hosting American operations and actively joining the war effort. A distinction that has proven difficult to maintain cleanly in practice. Meanwhile, international financial institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, have reportedly warned that the broader economic disruption from this conflict, driven substantially by oil price volatility tied to the strait, is contributing to slower global growth and higher prices well beyond the Middle East. None of that changes the technical story of what a bunker buster bomb does, but it does underline why a strike on a single missile site on the Iranian coastline can end up factoring into decisions made in London and Brussels and in Washington, far from the blast radius itself. Now, I want to pause here and be honest about something because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this script. War is not a highlight reel. Alongside the military reporting on precision strikes and hardened targets, human rights organizations tracking the conflict from inside Iran have reported significant civilian casualties as a result of the broader campaign, with some estimates citing figures in the thousands, including children. These figures have not been independently verified by neutral international bodies in the way that, say, the Central Command strike confirmation has, and estimates from different organizations have varied. But it would be dishonest to tell the story only through the lens of engineering and strategy without acknowledging that real people and real cities have died and been displaced because of this war. Whatever your view on the strategic necessity of any individual strike, that human cost is a fact of this conflict, not a footnote to it. Let's bring Dave back in for a moment because there's a technical detail here that actually connects directly to that human cost. I think it's one of the most important things to understand about how precision weapons like these are supposed to work, even if they don't always work perfectly in practice. The entire design philosophy behind penetrator weapons, like the GBU-57, the GBU-72, and the GBU-31, is built around minimizing the blast radius of the surface. Because the explosion happens deep underground or deep inside a hardened structure, the shockwave and fragmentation that would normally spread outward across a wide area gets largely contained by the surrounding rock or concrete. Dave described it to me this way. The goal of the weapon isn't to flatten a neighborhood, it's the opposite. It's to concentrate all of that destructive force into the smallest possible footprint, specifically so that the damage stays contained to the target itself, rather than spreading outward into everything around it. That's a meaningful distinction from, say, a large dumb bomb dropped on a surface target, which can create a much wider zone of destruction. It does not mean these strikes are risk-free to civilians nearby, especially in dense urban areas, but it does explain why military planners reach for these specific weapons when they want to eliminate a buried target while limiting collateral damage above ground. Dave also walked me through how these weapons actually find their targets, because it's easy to picture a giant metal cylinder falling out of the sky and assume it's basically just gravity doing the work, and that's not really how it functions. Modern penetrator bombs, like the GBU-72, use a guidance kit built around GPS signals combined with an inertial navigation system, essentially a set of internal sensors that keep track of the weapon's position even if satellite signal gets disrupted or jammed. The guidance kit is actually a close relative of the kits used on standard JDAM bombs, the kind that have been used in precision strikes for decades. What's different with a penetrator is everything wrapped around that guidance package. The nose is hardened and shaped specifically to survive punching through rock and concrete without breaking apart. And a specialized fuse inside the weapon is engineered to count layers as it descends, essentially sensing the difference between dense material and open voids inside a bunker so it can time its detonation for maximum effect, rather than exploding on first impact. That last detail matters enormously in a case like a nuclear facility built with multiple internal chambers because a fuse timed wrong could waste the entire weapon on an empty corridor instead of the room that actually matters. None of this happens on the fly either. Dave was clear that choosing which bomb to use on which target is its own extended process, involving detailed intelligence on how deep the structure is buried, what it's built from, and what's likely stored inside it. Planners have to weigh the size of weapon needed for penetration against what aircraft can actually deliver it, whether the mission requires the range and radar avoidance of a B-2 bomber carrying the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or whether a more available platform like an F-15E carrying a GBU-72 gets the job done with less risk and complexity. That decision-making process is a big part of why you see this range of different bomb sizes showing up across the same campaign rather than one single weapon being used everywhere. It's not indecision, but it's matching the tool to the target every single time. So where does this leave things right now? As of the most recent reporting we have, the picture that emerges is one of a campaign that has moved through phases. Early strikes focused heavily on nuclear infrastructure with Fordo as the signature target for the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. As the conflict widened, attention shifted toward Iran's conventional military capacity, particularly its ability to threaten shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, its ballistic missile production and storage, and its broader command structure. Reports have also described a related but distinct front opening up inside Iran itself, with Kurdish opposition groups in the country's western mountains reportedly increasing activity during the same period that Iranian air defenses in that region were degraded by the wider air campaign. Though the connection between those two developments remains something analysts are still debating rather than something officially confirmed as a coordinated strategy. There have been reports, again with the appropriate caveat that this is less firmly confirmed than a direct central command announcement, describing internal fractures within the Iranian government during this period, including public statements from hardline officials contradicting more conciliatory positions taken by Iran's negotiating team, and questions raised in various outlets about the visibility and condition of Iran's supreme leader, who reportedly has not made a confirmed public appearance in an extended period. I want to flag clearly that this particular thread involves a significant amount of speculation circulating in commentary and less verified reporting, and it should be treated with real skepticism, rather than presented as an established fact. It's worth pointing out just how unusual it is for modern conflict to combine all of these elements at once. A battlefield strategy built around deeply buried infrastructure, a global economic choke point running directly through the middle of it, and a diplomatic track that keeps collapsing and restarting in real time. Most military campaigns have a single center of gravity, one key objective that defines success or failure. This one has at least 3 running in parallel: the nuclear and military infrastructure campaign, the fight to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, and the fragile diplomatic effort trying to end the war altogether. And progress or setbacks in any one of those threads can shift the entire trajectory of the others almost overnight. What is more solidly documented is the diplomatic track running alongside the military one. A memorandum of understanding was reportedly signed earlier in the conflict, intended to create a framework for safe passage of commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz for a defined window of time. Multiple reports have described that agreement being violated through subsequent attacks on tankers, which in turn triggered further escalation and additional strikes, including reinstatement of naval measures in the region. The pattern that emerges from the public reporting, taken as a whole, is one of a fragile and repeatedly broken framework for de-escalation with military action stepping back, and each time diplomatic efforts falter. Let's bring both David and Marcus back one more time, because I think their two perspectives, the technical and the human, actually meet at the same conclusion, even though they come at this from completely different angles. Dave's view from years around these systems is that bunker buster bombs like the GBU-57 and GBU-72 represent one of the most significant shifts in modern precision warfare: the ability to eliminate a specific buried target without the massive footprint of older, cruder weapons. From his seat, the story here is fundamentally about engineering solving a problem that used to require far more destructive, far less precise tools. He's quick to point out that this technology didn't appear overnight, and that every generation of these weapons, from the improvised gun barrels of 1991 to the purpose-built penetrators flying today, represents a direct response to adversaries who kept digging deeper in an attempt to stay out of reach. Marcus's view from the deck of a ship trying to get cargo through a war zone is simpler and more immediate. He doesn't care as much about the specifications of the weapon. He cares about whether the waterway is safe enough to bring his crew home at the end of the trip, and whether the missile sites that were threatening ships like his are actually gone or just temporarily suppressed. He's also learned over the course of this conflict not to fully trust a lull in activity, because a quiet stretch of water can change in an instant. A quiet week doesn't mean the danger is over. It might just mean the next strike package or the next Iranian retaliation hasn't happened yet. And it's that tension between the technical precision of the weapon and the very human stakes riding on whether it actually works is really what this entire story comes down to. And it's a tension that isn't going away anytime soon, no matter how the next phase of this conflict unfolds. These bombs represent a genuine leap forward in the ability to destroy specific, deeply buried targets without leveling everything around them. Central Command's confirmed strikes on missile facilities near the Strait of Hormuz, on ammunition depots near Isfahan, and reportedly on other hardened sites throughout this campaign show a military using increasingly specific tools for increasingly specific problems. But precision in engineering does not automatically translate into a clean or simple outcome on the ground. Oil markets have been rattled. Civilian casualties have been reported by human rights organizations, even if the exact scale remains contested. Shipping through one of the most important waterways on Earth has been disrupted in ways that ripple out to gas prices thousands of miles away. And a diplomatic framework meant to prevent exactly this kind of escalation has been tested and broken more than once. There are also questions here that simply cannot be answered yet. And I'd rather tell you that plainly than pretend otherwise. We don't know with any real confidence how many hardened Iranian sites remain intact versus how many have actually been destroyed, because battle damage assessments of deeply buried structures take time, and initial reports in the middle of an active conflict are often revised later, sometimes significantly. We don't know whether the internal political fractures being reported inside Iran's government will lead to any meaningful change in how the country is run, whether they'll simply be absorbed the way previous periods of internal tension have been. We don't know if the diplomatic framework governing the Strait of Hormuz will hold this time, given that it has already been violated once. And we don't know what the final human toll of this conflict will look like once independent investigators, rather than wartime reporting, have had the chance to do a full accounting. Anyone who tells you they have confident answers to all of that right now is telling you more than the available evidence actually supports. So, where does that leave us? Based on everything we can verify right now, the campaign against Iran's hardened and buried infrastructure has been effective at eliminating specific targets, from missile storage sites to ammunition depots to reportedly deeply buried command facilities. Whether that translates into a durable resolution of the broader conflict, whether the Strait of Hormuz returns to normal shipping volumes, whether the diplomatic track holds this time, and whether the human cost continues to climb, all of that remains genuinely uncertain. And anyone telling you they know exactly how this ends is guessing, not reporting. What we do know is this: a weapon originally built to solve a very narrow engineering problem. How do you destroy something buried under 60 FT of rock without leveling the city on top of it? has become one of the central tools shaping a conflict with consequences reaching from a tanker captain's decision about whether to sail all the way to the price you pay at the pump. That's the story of the bunker buster bomb in 2026, told as clearly and as honestly as the available facts allow. Not a single explosion, but a chain reaction, technical, strategic, economic, and human. All set off by a weapon designed to go deep and stay quiet until it's already too late for whatever it was aimed at.